Okay, we're going to look at the rise of conservatism with this crash course. And then you have a flip grid that I believe goes along with this, but this is me adding some extra explanation that might help you for your test in the future also. So here we go.
All right, so in the 1950s, a growing number of libertarians argued that unregulated capitalism and individual autonomy were the essence of American freedom. And although they were staunchly anti-communist, their real target was the regulatory state that had been created by the New Deal, Social Security.
So in other words, he's talking about a type of conservative that starts to develop this idea of people who think that government has gotten too big. So during the New Deal, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt worked to get the United States out of the Depression through these programs, it expanded the government. Just like how now, with the COVID crisis, the government is expanding, it's getting bigger, it's taking over more and more things to try to look out for citizens. So things like Social Security, those are government programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and then especially under Lyndon Johnson, we see a lot of those develop. But there's a rise of the population in the 70s that do not want all these programs or this big expansion of government. They're going to want to make government smaller and give more and more power to individuals and businesses.
Security and not being allowed to, choose how many pigs you kill, etc. Other conservatives weren't libertarians at all, but moral.
Okay, this is a different type of conservative. So you're going to have to know two types of conservatives. There's a libertarian conservative, which is for individual freedom and business freedom and small government. And then there's a moral conservative, which is it's for small government, everything except for in terms of morality. So with a moral conservative, you want to make sure that the government has these ideas of morality that people follow. So, for example, in certain states, there's things called blue laws where people can't buy alcohol on Sunday because that is a day of worship. So that would be more an example of kind of an extreme example of a moral conservative.
Conservatives who were okay with the rules that enforced traditional notions of family and morality, even if that seemed like, an oppressive government. For them, virtue was the essence of America. But both of these strands of conservatism were very hostile toward communism and also to the idea of big government. And it's worth noting that since World War I, the size and scope of the federal government had increased dramatically. And hostility toward the idea of big government remains the signal feature of contemporary conservatism, although very few people actually argue for shrinking the government because, that would be very unpopular. People like Medicare. But it was faith in the free market that infused the ideology of the most vocal young conservatives in the 1960s. They didn't receive nearly as much press as their liberal counterparts, but these young conservatives played a pivotal role in reshaping the Republican Party, especially in the election of 1964. The 1964 presidential election was important in American history precisely because it was so incredibly uncompetitive. I mean, Lyndon Johnson.
So Lyndon Johnson was running for re-election. That's after Kennedy had died, and he's going to run against this new type of politician, this guy Barry Goldwater, who at the time wasn't popular, but today he would be extremely popular. Today you could say that the Republican Party is very much like Barry Goldwater, and it didn't used to be.
Johnson was carrying the torch of a wildly popular American president who had been assassinated a few months before. He was never going to lose. And indeed, he didn't. The Republican candidate, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, was demolished by LBJ. But the mere fact of Goldwater's nomination was a huge conservative victory. I mean, he beat out liberal Republican New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. And yes, there were liberal Republicans. Goldwater demanded a harder line in the Cold War, even suggesting that nuclear war might be an option in the fight against communism. And he lambasted the New Deal liberal welfare state for destroying American initiative and individual liberty. I mean, why bother working when you can just enjoy life on the dole? I mean, unemployment insurance allowed anyone in America to become a hundred-aire. But it was his stance on the Cold War that doomed his candidacy. In his acceptance speech, Goldwater famously declared, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice," which made it really easy for Johnson to paint Goldwater as an extremist. In the famous Daisy advertisement, Johnson supporters countered Goldwater's campaign slogan of "In your heart, you know he's right" with "But in your guts, you know he's nuts."
So in other words, Barry Goldwater said, he talked about how if you're fighting communism, you can never be too extreme, which made him sound extreme. And so the Lyndon Johnson campaign made a commercial of a kid in a field, and then a nuclear explosion going off behind her. And what it was saying is that's what would happen if Lyndon Johnson, if Barry Goldwater had become elected. So they make Barry Goldwater look like a crazy man, and he loses. But he does get a lot of followers. And today you could say that he created the modern Republican Party.
So in the end, Goldwater received a paltry 27 million votes to Johnson's 43 million, and Democrats racked up huge majorities in both houses of Congress. This hides, however, the significance of the election. 5 of the 6 states that Goldwater carried were in the Deep South, which had been reliably Democratic.
And boom, there you see it. The South switches at that point from Democrat to Republican. Before they had been Democrat and supported Lyndon Johnson, now you see them switch. They're supporting Barry Goldwater. And to this day, the South does primarily support Republican politicians.
Known as the Solid South, in fact. Now, it's too simple to say that race alone led to the shift from Democratic to the Republican Party in the South, because Goldwater didn't really talk much about race. But the Democrats, especially under LBJ, became the...
So, this is one thing that maybe caused the Democrats to lose popularity in the South. This picture alone, you can see Lyndon Johnson working very closely with Dr. King. And those ideas of racism and racial separation were still very dominant in the South. So this Democrat here, working with this African American, started to cause many Democrats in the South to leave the Democratic Party because they didn't like how it was focusing so much on things like ending segregation and not focusing more on other things like, I guess, the economy.
The party associated with defending civil rights and ending segregation, and that definitely played a role in white Southerners abandoning the Democratic Party, as was demonstrated even more clearly in the 1968 election. The election of 1968 was a real cluster, Calhoun. I mean, there were riots, and there was also the nomination of Hubert Humphrey, who was very unpopular with the anti-war movement and also was named Hubert Humphrey, and that's just what happened with the Democrats. But lost in that picture was the Republican nominee, Richard Milhouse Nixon, who was one of the few candidates in American history to come back and win the presidency after losing in a previous election. How'd he do it? Well, it probably wasn't his charm, but it might have been his patience. Nixon was famous for his ability to sit and wait in poker games. It made him very successful during his tour of duty in the South Pacific. In fact, he earned the nickname Old Iron Butt. Plus, he was anti-communist, but didn't talk a lot about nuking people, and the clincher was probably that he was from California, which by the late 1960s was becoming the most populous state in the nation. Nixon won the election, campaigning as the candidate of the silent majority of Americans who weren't anti-war protesters and who didn't admire free love or the communal ideas of hippies, and who were alarmed at the rights that the Supreme Court seemed to be expecting.
So one reason Nixon wins too, people were worried about the Supreme Court. Remember, the Warren Court had expanded tons and tons and tons of rights, including those of criminals. And so a lot of Americans think that the court has gone too far in giving rights to criminals. Nixon promises to be tough on crime and crack down on criminals. And so since being tough on crime for most of U.S. history, it seems like it's been a very popular theme. This is changing slightly recently. Nixon does become popular because he says, I'm going to be tough on crime. The court has been not tough enough on these people.
Expanding, especially for criminals. This silent majority felt that the rights revolution had gone too far. I mean, they were concerned about the breakdown in traditional values and in law and order. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Nixon also promised to be tough on crime, which was coded language to whites in the South that he wouldn't support civil rights protests. The equation of crime with African Americans has a long and sordid history in the United States, and Nixon played it up following a Southern strategy to further draw white Democrats who favored segregation into the Republican ranks. Now, Nixon only won 43% of the vote, but if you paid attention to American history, you know that you ain't got to win a majority to be the president. He was denied that majority primarily by Alabama Governor.
So this is someone to think about. This is pretty wild here. So we had in this election Humphrey versus Nixon, so Democrat versus Republican, but then we had an independent person here, George Wallace, who was running on a pro-segregation ticket. He was wanting to bring back segregation to America.
George Wallace, who was running on a pro-segregation ticket and won 13% of the vote. So 56% of American voters chose candidates who were either...
Let this sink in. So 56% of Americans either chose candidates who were explicitly or quietly against ending segregation.
Explicitly or quietly against civil rights. Conservatives who voted for Nixon hoping that he would roll back the New Deal were disappointed. I mean, in some ways, the Nixon domestic agenda was just a continuation of LBJ's Great Society. This was partly because Congress was still in the hands of Democrats, but also Nixon didn't push for conservative programs, and he didn't veto new initiatives because they were popular. And he liked to be popular. So, in fact, a number of big government liberal programs began under Nixon.
So, yeah, Nixon, he disappointed a lot of libertarian conservatives because he didn't get rid of the government programs that they had wanted him to get rid of. Moral conservatives do appreciate him because he promises to be tough on crime. But he does do a lot of programs that today would be labeled as liberal. There's a lot of things that Nixon does outside of what we remember him for, which is Watergate. So let's look at some of those programs.
I mean, the environmental movement achieved success with the enactment of
the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. That happened under Richard Nixon.
Air Act and the Clean Water Act and
the Endangered Species Act. The Occupational Health and Safety. This is called OSHA. This makes sure that at your job you are protected and don't die of a crazy injury, and it gives us safety standards for work. So if you work for the water department, you won't be, exposed to chlorine gas because it's a violation of OSHA.
Species Act. The Occupational Health and Safety Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board were created to make new regulations that would protect worker safety and make cars safer. That's not government getting out of our lives, that's government getting into our cars. And when Nixon had the opportunity to nominate a new Chief Justice to the Supreme Court after Earl Warren retired in 1969, his choice, Warren Burger, was supposed to be a supporter of small government and conservative ideals.
So this is Burger here. Warren Burger. He's going to be our next Supreme Court justice. We ended the other one, the Earl Warren Court, which expanded a lot of rights, probably the most expansive court in U.S. history.
But just like Nixon, he proved a disappointment in that regard, like in Swan versus...
So some cases that we want to look at under the Burger Court are Swan versus Board of Education.
Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, the court upheld a lower court ruling that required busing of students to achieve integration in Charlotte's school.
So in other words, it says during this court, the Supreme Court says that students can be taken to different school districts in order to integrate them. Because remember, because of redlining, all these different races lived in separate neighborhoods, and it was creating segregation throughout the United States. So the idea of busing would take, let's say, African-American kids from a neighborhood and bring them to a white neighborhood. As you can guess, of course, this caused a huge backlash. And especially in Boston, there was giant protests as people didn't want integration to happen in their neighborhoods. But the Supreme Court upholds it. The Supreme Court says you can bus people, and that is Swan versus Board of Education.
And then the Burger Court made it easier for minorities to sue for employment discrimination, especially with its ruling in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. This upheld affirmative action as a valid governmental interest.
And then this one says that affirmative action can happen. In other words, schools can take into account what other groups have been through in their admissions process, or they can make sure they allow a certain amount of different races and ethnicities and classes to get into their school. This is a very controversial thing to this day that two sides argue over.
Although it did strike down the use of strict quotas in university admissions. Now, many conservatives didn't like these affirmative action decisions, but one case above all others had a profound effect on American politics.
We will pick up at Roe v. Wade.